Okay, so after that, not quite as brief as I would have liked, overview of how UVs work, figure the best way to actually understand it is to do it. And here is this coffee mug that we made way back in week 2, was it? I think it was 2. And at the time, we just applied simple textures to it, or materials to it, and that was it. See, if I hit 6 on the keypad, there are no textures applied. But now, we are older and wiser and ready to tackle new things. So, first let's get ready to work with UVs. So I'm going to go to the UV menu and UV editor. And that's going to open up your UV editor. You may have the UV toolkit docked to the side of it. Okay. Like I said, I took the tab and I moved it to my sidebar here underneath Attribute Editor. And then the UV editor itself, you can either dock into the main viewport, keep it separate. You could also just go to your workspace up here and change it to UV editing. It'll get you roughly the same layout. So, what we need to do, first, if we look at how the UVs are currently laid out, if we look at this mug as it exists, see, the front side looks great, but the underside has weird seams. The squares are not all the same size. The handle is a mess. The inside is nonsense. So we've got a lot of work to do. But it's not that bad. We'll be okay. So let's get rid of all of this crappy UV work. So we're going to go to the UV menu and delete UVs. And that just gets rid of them. And the next thing that we're going to do is create a new, fresh, clean UV set. And to do that, you're going to select the mug. And in your UV toolkit, add a new UV set. Also, by the way, I'm going to turn off this grid icon. Just keep that off for now. There's a few different ways you can create new UVs. And actually, if you go to the UV menu, or go to the Create tab in the toolkit, you'll see 8 of them. You do an automatic, it's called a projection. So what it does is kind of lays out the UVs from a particular view or multiple views. So if we do like automatic, what it's going to do is you'll see here in the viewport, we've got 6 planes, and basically it's looking at the object from all different sides, and then it's laying out what it sees in the UV editor. Now the way it does this, there's a lot of UV shells, there's a lot of seams, and it's unnecessary. But that's one way that you can do it. The way we're going to be focusing on is planar projection, and that's just going to be projecting from one view, like looking at it from one view. And then we'll go on from there. So it's just a starting point. It's not going to be the final UVs, but it is a starting point. So I'm going to select the mug, and I'm going to click on, hold down Shift and click on Planar, and that's going to open up the options. And there's a couple of options we need to pay attention to. The first is Project From Axis, and we want to project from the front. And so if we look down here in the bottom left of the viewport, you can see that's the Z axis. So I'm going to select Z. And keep image width height ratio. We want to make sure that's checked. Otherwise, Maya will stretch this out in the UV editor when it lays out the UVs. I'll show you what it does. I'll click Apply, and you can see now the mug looks a lot taller than it does in the scene. We don't want that, right? We want to keep things undistorted. If I turn on my checkerboard, you can see all of the squares are actually rectangles. Again, not what we want. So I will undo that. Turn on Keep Image Width Height Ratio. Click Project. Okay, now we have our mug. And you can see the plane that it's projecting from. And as we look at our mug in the viewport, the front looks great because that's the side we projected from. But the sides, we have a lot of distortion and banding all the way across, because it's not even where the seams are, it's just it like flattened the UVs. we can see that it's a good start, but we're not there yet. So now we need to start worrying about cutting seams so this whole thing can lay out flat with minimal distortion. So I'm going to start with the tops and the bottoms. I'm going to turn off the checkerboard because it's going to be a lot easier to see. And I'm going to go into edge mode. And I'm going to start with this inside edge. And you see there's a quad, so it's not a perfect circle. But we're going to double click on that edge. I'm going to select that whole loop. And in my UV toolkit, under cut and sew, because when we're dealing with seams, think of it as fabric and patterning and making clothes. That analogy runs all the way through the UV editor. You're cutting seams to break them apart, and you're sewing them together to join them. We're just going to click on cut. And you see that edge now is a little bit wider. And if we deselect that edge, and you can't really see because it's a white object, but the edge is fatter than the rest of them. Tells us that there is a seam there. So now that I have that, I can kind of unwrap that or unfold that. So I'm going to right click and go to UV shell, and select that shell. All right, because I made that seam all the way around. That's now a separate shell. It's not, the polygons have not been separated. All right, it's just the texture space that's been separated. I'm going to select that shell, and we've got this unfold section here in our UV toolkit. Actually, no, sorry, not unfold. We're not there yet. We're going to go back up and we're going to do another planar projection. So I'm going to hold down Shift, click on planar to bring up my options. And this time, I don't want to project from the Z, because if I look at it this way, it's just going to be a line, and that doesn't give me any texture space. So I want to look at it straight on. So this time, it's going to be the Y-axis, right? Because I'm looking straight down into it. Y-axis, I'm going to click project. Right, and you can see that pops up in my UV editor. I can then hit W to bring up my move tool and just move that off to the side. We'll come back to that a little bit later. We can check on that, turn the grid back on, and now if we look down into our mug, we've got a bunch of nice and tidy squares that are all the same size. Okay, so that's the bottom. We're going to do the same thing for the outside bottom. I'll turn off the checkerboard. Hopefully that's a little bit more clear. I'm going to select this edge right here. Just double click on it to select the whole thing. All right, and cut that. Then I will go back to my UV shell selection. Select it. I'm going to do the exact same projection. And because my settings are already established, I can just click on planar and it will project that as well. Okay. And we can again check that with the checkerboard pattern, and it looks good to me. So up next we have the rest of the body of the mug. All right, we're going to break this up into 3 pieces. We're going to do the outside, the inside surface, and then the handle is going to be separate. So let's worry about the inside first. And again, I'll turn off the checkerboard so we can see this a little bit better. I'm going to go to edge mode, and there's one edge right along the top center of that rim. I'm going to double click on that, and I will cut a seam there. Okay, right along the top. I'm going to, just for clarity's sake here, with this mug, I'm going to make it a little bit darker so that edges stand out a little bit more for the video. I think that will help. All right, so now you can see that a little bit better. So I've cut that, and now I go back to my UV shell, select that, and if I try to project this now, well, one, there's not a great angle to project this because no matter which way I look at it, I'm not going to see all of the faces. But the other issue is, even though this is a separate shell, it's not going to be able to lay flat because there's no inside seam. So I'm going to add a seam somewhere I'm not going to see it. And I'm going to say right here. I'll select, whoops, undo that. I will select these edges right here and zoom in. There's a little edge connected to that rim. And I will cut that. Okay, so now I've got a seam going up the side. Now I can select this shell. And this time, instead of doing a planar projection, we're going to unfold this. And unfolding is, instead of projecting, which is, you know, looking at it from a particular angle, to unfold, Maya is going to take that and just try to lay it as flat as possible with as little distortion as possible. So there's an unfold section of your UV toolkit. I'm going to hold down Shift and click on the Unfold button, and it's going to bring up this window. Now, the defaults are great, but you may not have the option to choose Unfold 3D as a method. If you don't, it just means the plugin is not enabled, so you'll need to go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and if you just search for Unfold, you'll see Unfold 3D Bundle. Make sure it's set to load and auto load. Okay, so if you don't have that option, you need it, and that's where you go. So Unfold 3D. Default options are good for this. I just wanted to make sure that you are using Unfold 3D. I'm going to click Apply and Close, and now you can see that it has unfolded the interior of the mug and just laid it out kind of haphazardly across the UV editor. Again, I'll turn on our checkerboard to kind of monitor it. So the sizes look pretty good. There's some weird distortion there I don't like. So actually what I think I'm going to do, because this, I know it's probably not going to be seen a whole lot, but I'm going to move where that edge is. So now I could just undo back, but I also want to show you how to sew things back together because you may need to do that at some point, and it's good to know. So I'm going to reselect those edges that I just cut, and I'm going to sew. Okay. Now the UV editor is going to get kind of weird for a minute. Don't worry about that. We're going to cut a new seam, and I'm just going to, let's see. I'm not going to see this, so I'm going to just jump over a couple of edges, and I'll cut there. Okay, and then I'll go back to UV shell, select it, and unfold it again. There we go. And now we're not getting... Oh. We are still getting a little bit of that. Well, again, we're not really going to see it from this angle. That's one thing to keep in mind as you're placing your scenes is if this is the front of the mug, I'm not going to see that edge. I'm not going to see that seam. So that's an okay place to hide it. Okay, so I'm going to select that shell, and I'm just going to move it out of the way. I'm also going to rotate it so that it's roughly horizontal, so that all of the squares are going roughly straight across. And now we have the front of the mug to deal with and the handle. So first thing I'm going to do is just cut the handle away. So I'm going to select this edge and this edge, okay, which is right where the handle joins the main body of the mug, and we'll cut there. Okay. And then we need to, for the main body of the mug, we need to place a vertical seam so it can lay flat, and I'll just go straight down the back side. So I'm going to select that edge right there, okay, this first edge, just give you a little bit more screen real estate here. So that first edge, and then I will hold down Shift and double click on that last edge, and it will select all of the edges in between, and I will cut that. Okay, now I can go back to my UV shell and unfold. We'll turn on our checkerboard. Board looks pretty good. See, we're not getting any distortion on the seam here. I just want to rotate this, so I'll hit E in the UV editor and just spin that around. And you can zoom in a little bit and get really close as you want. And then I will move that off to the side. Okay. So now we just have this handle to deal with. And if I try to unfold the handle right now, you can see I get a weird blob. And it looks terrible in the viewport. So what that means is we need to add one more seam. And I'm going to add this seam right on the inside of the mug. So I'm going to select that edge, hold down Shift, and just kind of double click along the path. Whoops. Turn off that so you can see. So select that, hold down Shift, I'll double click there, and complete it there. And I will cut that. Now we can select that shell and unwrap it. Or unfold it, excuse me. Alright, we'll check our checkerboard. And the squares are looking square, which is wonderful. Again, we can rotate that as needed. And now we have everything unwrapped. We're not done yet, but the placing of the seams and unfolding them is just about done. So now, what we need to concern ourselves with is two things. One, we need to get all of our UVs packed into that 1x1 area here. The other thing we need to make sure we do is keep everything the same relative size. Okay, we don't want one section, okay, let's say we scale this way up and then we scale this way down. Okay, that means we're going to have a whole lot of texture detail here and a whole very little texture detail on the inside. Now, sometimes that's okay. If you know you're not really going to see one side, or you're not going to see one side up close, and you really want to save that texture detail for the featured side, great. But for the most part, and definitely in this case, we want everything to be the same size. Okay, that way you have freedom to look at the object from any view. That's one reason is packing in that texture detail. The other thing is, if you're like in this case, if we were applying one consistent texture across the whole thing, let's say we were, well, I mean the checkerboard pattern. This should be consistent, because if something was a checkerboard pattern, or say it was wicker or it was brick, I don't know why you would have a brick mug, but maybe you have a brick mug, you wouldn't have bricks be enormous on the inside and then really small on the outside. Okay, that's not how anything works, really. So keeping squares consistent size and packing them into the 0 to 1 UV space. The nice thing is there are buttons that will do that mostly for us in the UV toolkit. So the first thing is making sure that what it's actually called the Texel density. So texture pixel, I believe, is where Texel comes from. But we want to make sure that all the squares are the same size. So I'm going to select one of the islands, one of the shells. Doesn't matter which one. In this case, I will select this inside one. But again, doesn't matter. And then we go to the transform section and go down to Texel density, which is pixels per unit. Okay. And we want to say get. And that's going to tell us how many texels per Maya unit are in this UV shell. Okay, so we select that, we get it, and then we want to set everything else to that value. So we just have to select the other UV shells, and oops, get that one too. There we go. Click set, and then it's going to automatically scale them all down to the same size, and now you see our mug, all of the squares are the same size, which is wonderful. Okay, so now the last step, select all of your UV shells, and we just need to lay them out in that 0 to 1 space. So if we go all the way down to arrange and layout, we can click on layout, and the default settings will be fine, and it just pops them in to that 0 to 1 space, which is fantastic. Okay, so that's UV unwrapping a mug. The next step is going to be exporting this UV layout into Photoshop, and then from there we can apply textures, whether that be photographic or hand painted, however you want to do it. So that'll be the next video.